All right, folks. This is a really quick PowerPoint to give you an idea for those of you that are um, in a remote setting, or if you want this for a review. And so that's what this is for. Now, I can't click and play any of the YouTube videos. So, and I will post some of these YouTube videos into a special section under the Great Depression for you to kind of focus more, or I might put them in a culture area in the Google Classroom for you to go and look at. However, you are more than welcome. I've placed this PowerPoint online for you. So you're more than welcome to go in and look at any of these and click on and watch the YouTube video. So let's real quick. Why culture? Now, this is what you have to understand. Why we're going to spend time talking about culture is culture is everything. It's like when your parents look at you now in what's going on in our world today and they say, well, when I was in high school, that's a cultural conflict. Their concept of high school is 1990s, 1980s high school. And I can tell you, as a product of the 1980s, my time in high school was very different than your time. The fashions we wore, the social cliques. We always like to think, well, kids are kids, but those cliques actually change. And things that were socially unacceptable back in the 1980s and 90s today are socially acceptable. Think about when I was your age, I got broken up with by a note. You get broken up by a tweet at 4 a.m., but I had to get the note at school. Or the fact that for me, I knew people talked behind my back when I was 17, but when I left high school, I left that behind. I went home, I was home. Everything that happened at school follows with you with with your phone and the internet. So the culture we're talking about and they develop who we are as a culture, our concept of how we deal with things, how we relate with things. When I was a kid, standardized test wasn't a big thing. Then in the 90s and the early 2000s, you had No Child Left Behind. And today you are tested like all the time. Or the simple fact of something like going out to eat. In the 1930s, you went to a diner if you had the money to go out to eat. By the 1950s, you had the drive-in where people would sit in their car. That was, in fact, where the car was changing American culture. And that led to development of things like McDonald's and things like that. Then fast forward to the 1980s, and now you had the drive up window. And you talk through the little speaker, and then someone would hand you your food. Today, you've got Grubhub because of the internet and obviously what happened in the pandemics that take place. So culture can be changed by technology or the situation we live in. It can also be something that we develop as a reaction to things like civil rights movement or women's rights and how we dress. It could happen because of economics. So sometimes culture is a reflection of our time period and who we are. And sometimes it's the thing that there's one part that drives our culture. And sometimes the things that are in culture also influence how we end up viewing events or how we react to events. So let's talk about these. Let's look at these. Okay. So as far as fashion, and you can click right here. This is a YouTube video that kind of gives you an idea of dance styles and fashion. One of the biggest things you'd notice, then we talked about flappers. Now, men clothing wise pretty much didn't change a lot. The cut was a little different. Men always wore hats when they went out, if you weren't had a lot of money. But when we talked about women with flappers, the short hair, the very, outlandish clothing with the beads and shortness and everything. By the 30s, notice that this goes back to much simpler. The patterns are simpler. The cuts are simpler. The length is a little bit longer. If you notice the hair here, and by the late 40s, early 50s, you're going to see a different kind of cut. But we'll talk about the 50 fashions later. But this longer hair you're seeing on women in the 30s and 40s, that's more driven by economics. It's like in the 1980s fashion was driven very much as a way of showing your money, the showing your position. That was the yuppie. And then the 90s, the grunge movement was a rebellion against those yuppies and their clothing in the 1980s. And so here, women are wearing more simple cuts and more simple patterns and wearing their hair longer because of financial reasons, because of the Great Depression. Now, obviously, in the 40s, women are start wearing pants. Like if you play the YouTube video, that's more because it's a little hard to weld a B-17 together in a skirt. So women's liberation is going to have an effect on this. And we'll talk about how fashion also reflects, like we did in the 80s, it reflects our cultural norms and values as we go. Um, the 30s are full of cultural references. And the biggest thing here to understand, movies in the Great Depression were an escape. They're a way of getting away from everything that was happening. And you could spend an entire day in the movies for 25 cents. You could spend the entire day in the movies. You could buy something to eat, have a soda, you could have popcorn and watch two full-length movies. And so what would happen, you get in there, they'd show some trailers for movies that are coming. They'd show you some newsreels, which kind of filled in about how the news was happening, what was happening in the world. Then there'd be some cartoons. This is the beginning of Warner Brothers and Disney. There's those short Mickey Mouse cartoons that are on Disney Plus, and then there's also the Warner Brothers Bugs Bunny cartoons that you saw, 1940s, 1930s, that are on HBO Max. And then they'd have a newsreel, which was or another newsreel, and then they have a serial, and a serial was kind of like Grey's Anatomy today. It's where every episode there's a run going story. So you'd have like Captain America or something like that would be fighting, and then there'd be a cliffhanger because literally in these many times it was they fell off a cliff. And then you got to come back next week to see what happened. Much like a drama today, like if you're watching WandaVision or you're watching one of these other shows that are on television, they leave you with this thing that goes, you want to come back and watch the next episode. Then there'd be a full length movie, and then it would start all over again. And there were a lot of musicals. They were cheap. Musicals were a thing. They were cheap. Comedies, popular things. And so the movies were an escape, much like today. You think about 1930s as a way of getting away from the Great Depression. Fast forward to the 21st century, and this is how you use Netflix to escape from the social, political, and economic problems that are happening in our world today. This is why you go binge things. Okay? Radio, the thing here, what made radio is that it brought the entertainment into the people's homes. And so this is going to create the concept of sports that we see in America. It's going to create the idea of news that if we could hear what's happening as it's happening. And then you're going to have entertainment, which is going to set the stage for many of these early television programs like The Lone Ranger and things like that, literally started on radio and then moved into our homes in the version of television. It also brought music into our homes and helped create this new type of jazz called swing, which we'll talk about. The other thing is that for once we all got the same story and we all got the same joke. So it became an American concept. And so radio was, this is the news. That's why President Roosevelt is going to use fireside chats, use the radio to get the message out and to tell people, this is what I'm doing. This is how this is working. Fast forward to the 50s, that by now, or by the radio moves to television and you could see the news. Fast forward to the 70s and 60s, that's when the news, you'd look at it, the government would tell you we were winning the Vietnam War, and then you're watching it on TV going, that don't look like winning. So television then started shaping our public opinions in the 50s with the civil rights movement and the 60s with the Vietnam War. And then when you get to the more modern age, the 90s, you got 24-hour news cycle. And then when you get into the modern age, where in the radio in the 30s gave us all the same story, today we all get a different story. I get the story I want to hear. And so that's what causes a lot of the cultural divides. I get mine, you get yours, we don't believe each other, and then we fight. See how that works? Sports becomes an escapism too. We also see the beginning of the sports star, much like we're seeing the beginning of the Hollywood star, since it's the golden age of movies. But we're also going to see where racism is going to fit into this, in that men like Joe Louis and men like Jesse Owens are going to stand up against Nazi tyranny and Nazi concepts of the master race. But yet they can't eat and sleep in places in America because of segregation. So, all right. So movies, like we said, whole genre. And many of these, if you've been to some of these very ornate, like the Coronado and places like that, these were very ornate movie theaters. And there's a move away from live performances. And before movies, there was vaudeville. And now you're seeing an end of live theater and the beginning of movies. It's like, why do I need to go see a live performance when I can just go see a movie? So, and some of these movies we're talking now, this is a video clip. I'm going to try to post this on itself by itself up. But if you want to go into this PowerPoint and watch this video off YouTube, it gives you the top 1930s movies. And I'll explain a lot more about the movies that we're going to fly through here real quick. One, we're going to go through a bunch of stars real quick. Clark Gable's the heartthrob, the biggest film star. He has the very first curse word in movie history when he says, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn." W.C. Fields is the old curmudgeon guy. It's the like today it'd be the dad who's always grumbling about the kids and complaining about the kids on the TV sitcoms. Um, Errol Flynn is like the Tom Cruise of the time, the action hero kind of thing. Um, Ryan Reynolds, that'd be like Ryan Reynolds. Fred Astaire was dancing, and being a dancer was very important during this time period. And musicals were a very cheap entertainment method that Hollywood used to entertain people because you could just churn these things out. Plus, they're happy and they're low cost. You get a bunch of singers, get a dancer, plots are all the same, and then they churn them out. Think about White Christmas that you watch at Christmas time with Danny Kaye and Bing Cosby. That's the kind of movie they're churning out. And that one, by the way, is post World War II, though. So Basil Rathbone is kind of the heavy drama mystery guy. He also appears in Robin Hood as the bad guy. He's kind of an action hero slash. He's more of the Harrison Ford action movie, all broody kind of thing. And by the way, if you click, there's a clip here. There's a clip here you can click. And, just go in and when you open this file, just go in and click around. You'll find these things. The Marx Brothers are like the forerunners to people like Jim Carrey, right? They're the both. They tell jokes and they do turns on words like Ryan Reynolds, in Deadpool kind of thing, or like Jim Carrey in Dumb and Dumber. It's kind of like that. So there's a lot of physical comedy, and at the same time, a lot of turn on words. Like my favorite joke is from Harpo Marx is one morning I woke up and it's a movie. About Africa. He's an African safari. He goes, one morning I woke up and shot an elephant in my pajamas. How I got my pajamas, I'll never know. That's the idea. Okay. And these are some great movies. These are some of my favorite comedies in the 1930s. And if you play this clip, you'll get it. Or if you see the top 10 thing. Women, very heavy in the heartthrob, lots of like implied sexuality, because, obviously you can't do that in movies in the 30s, but there's an implied sexuality. And of course, women are always the traditional damsel in distress needing rescued. And you're going to see that with Betty Davis, all these. Jane Harlow, that's the bombshell kind of thing. Mae West plays that body sexual. Her sexuality is the joke, if that makes sense. So, and she makes all these kind of like sexual jokes. She's like the forerunner in sexuality to Marilyn Monroe in the 50s, but she's a comedian. And so as a comedian, she could get away with saying things that are a little bit more sexual than the other stars could and that men could. And so it's very much she's playing off her sexuality and this idea of, we can have a good time, boys, as the joke. So think about, the sexy comedian kind of thing in the movies. Okay. And of course, there's a child star. Everybody likes a child star in this time period. Shirley Temple, probably the most well known. Dracula. Now, this is where we're talking about the culture thing. Dracula, like we talked about in class, is that 90% of all zombie movies were actually made after 9/11, because movies have a tendency not only as escapism, and they also reflect how we see society. Like I said, women were very much the needing to be rescued girl in the 30s, right? And men were the action heroes. So it's very much reinforcing the stereotypical roles. And there aren't very many African American actors. That if they're an African American actor, they're mostly the bellhops, the servants, stuff like that. So there's a definite racism in Hollywood. Native Americans were actually played by Hispanic actors or whites wearing makeup. Dracula is a manifestation of another fear. That a lot of times movies show our fear, and that's why I told you about the zombie movies in the 1990s. The reason why zombie movies became so popular in the the 2000s is because of 9/11. That the fear that there's this out there force, there's something out there that we can't stop. It's constantly coming. If you kill one zombie, 10 more come after you, and they never stop. You kill them and there's 100 more. You kill them and there's 300 more. And there's like after wave. We fought wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, um, Syria, and we still get trucks that drive through Christmas markets. It's, you just can't stop it. And so the movies then reflect that fear. Just like today, the movies you see more today are drifting a little bit away from the zombie thing, and it's more we're fear of each other. You see a lot more of the serial killer movies. You see a lot more of these movies where we are the enemy. Things like The Purge, that guy that your friendly next door neighbor who borrows your hedge trimmer, and then the next day he's over trying to use the hedge trimmer to cut your head off. Today, the movies reflect our fear of each other, that we are a danger to ourselves. And then we have fear of terrorism in the 2000s. And then that same zombie movie in the 1950s, 70s, 60s, that was the fear of the apocalypse, that there's something that could destroy us all. That's the George Romero zombies, right? That something out there unleashed this thing that's going to destroy the entire world. And in the 50s, the zombie was also the fear of the Russians, that something could come and take our minds over and make us do things we don't want to do. And then we used aliens in the metaphor for that, but we're really talking about the Russians. Well, how does Dracula fit in this? Well, in the 30s, there were zombie movies too. There was a movie called White Zombie, which, guess what? Bela Lugosi was the star of. And Bela Lugosi played Dracula. And to a degree, Dracula is a zombie. He's a dead creature that comes back and feeds on the living, much like a zombie does. But the point is that the zombies in the White Zombie in the 1930s weren't the things that are caused by a virus or some radioactive cloud or something like that unleashes this apocalyptic thing on us. It's the other, that some weird witch doctor who with a weird accent is going to take over our minds and make us do things we shouldn't do, or unleash this horror upon us. Or Dracula, he manipulates the minds of people like Renfield, or seduces the young girls, and he talks with this weird accent, and he wears this cape and stuff, from like dresses like he's from somewhere else. He's Eastern European. It's fear of the other, fear of people that aren't like us, right? That's the fear. That movies like Dracula, by the way, Bela Lugosi, this movie ruined his life. He was a well-renowned actor, and then he played Dracula, and he couldn't get another part after this, really, except being the bad guys in monster movies. And he's actually buried in this costume. He's buried in his Dracula costume. Yeah, there you go. Or Frankenstein. This idea that there's something different than us that's going to come and destroy us. So it's fear that those people from other countries are going to come here and destroy us. And so you're going to see that manifest itself in later, that, with the movement of the Klan we saw in the 20s, or with the rise of the Nazi Party in America, that there is a lot of fear of people that aren't like us, and we can get a really quick solution to stop these things. Gone with the Wind is one of the best example. It's a one of these mega picture films that come out, that it's this huge movie. It's 2.5 hours long and has these great sweeping colorized pictures and these huge sets and huge cast. And so it's the first of the mega pictures, right? It takes in a huge amount of people. Still today go see Gone with the Wind in theaters and dress in antebellum costumes like they're in the Civil War to watch it. It also was one of the great whitewashings of history. That basically, Gone with the Wind, the book had already tried to do this, but the movie seceded where the book wasn't really making it. is that it retold the Civil War in a perspective that the South really didn't lose the war, that it was a war against their culture. And by God, we're going to defeat those Yanks. And that it's romantic, that the Civil War and antebellum and slavery was a good thing. And it also paints the idea that African Americans actually kind of enjoyed slavery. We're going to see this again with a movie called Song of the South. Disney will never release that movie from their vault. It's never going to show up on Disney Plus because of that very reason. It made it sound like slavery wasn't that bad a gig. So it was a bad gig. It was so yeah. Oops. All right. King Kong let the stage for all our special effects we have today. It's not a far line to draw from King Kong and a little monkey puppet on top of the Empire State Building to blue screens and Pixar Disney animation. So this was also Hitler's favorite movie. Just saying. It also was the first of the large monster movies. King Kong's one of the very first large monster movies, which then sets the stage after World War II or for the big monster movies like Them, Godzilla, Rodan, Mothra, King Kong versus Godzilla. Look them up. They're out there. Okay. Wizard of Oz, first color film. Okay. And then Snow White sets the stage for the Disney Empire. And eventually it's going to change the way you buy things and how you go to things and everything. They told Disney, who had already started making good money off his short animated films that were put into movie theaters in between those trailers and everything, that no one would ever pay to see a full length motion picture. And he proved him wrong. And this was a job a woman could get in Hollywood too. This helps in the women in the arts departments because a lot of women, these are drawn on plastic cells, right? And so they would draw each frame, frame by frame, to take pictures of. And then rooms the size of our gymnasium would be full of artists that would paint these. And many of these were women who would paint the cells. And so it was a woman's job in Hollywood in the animation. So how's this going to change the way you shop and everything? Because this empire that's going to be created from these full-length movies are eventually going to feed into with the interstate highway system the creation of something called Disneyland. But to advertise it, um, Disney figured out a new trick. He created a television show that sold his products. Think for you in your childhood, Power Rangers. You had to buy all those Power Rangers because every so often they'd create a new television series that made you buy new Power Rangers. See my point? Okay. Well, that's kind of what this is. He creates this thing called the Mickey Mouse Club in the 1950s. All these little kids sit around and watch the Mickey Mouse Club, and they see all those nice new products, and they see those nice new shows and movies, and they see this nice new place called Disneyland. And because the interstate highway system and the car and the fact dad has money because he lives in the suburbs and has a decent job, well, he then decides that it's time that we go on a vacation, and he decides to take them to this new place called Disneyland that's being advertised in the show. You see where this is all going? Okay. The serial where he talked about some of these are where your heroes are today. Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers. Well, Buck Rogers comes later. Roy Rogers was in one of these. Batman, Superman, Captain America in the 40s. Okay. Radio, this is another clip for you to watch. And by the way, this is a serial. The Buck Rogers. Buck Rogers was during this time period. You can watch this. It's an example of some of these serials. Um, radio, you can click on this, it gives you a preview of radio. And many of these, you can see, are actually radio clips. Radio, you could watch news, or not watch, sorry, hear news as it happened. That's the Hindenburg. Um, Advertising, it was a new way of advertising. Set the stage for the commercial that you're going to see later in the 1950s on television. That right in the middle of the show, they'd stop the show and they'd give you a product advertisement. And then people would go out and buy the advertisement because they heard about it on the radio. There were comedies like you see here. Radio, you'd hear music like Bing Crosby on the radio. There were shows like The Shadow. And this is a good example of who's on first. And for the first time, everyone got the same joke. This one really showed the power of the radio. It was a fake Halloween broadcast of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds done by Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater. on the radio. And they did it as if the aliens were attacking New York City. But if you tuned in halfway through the show, people actually thought this was real. It wasn't. It's always been hyped up that it was bigger than it was, but there were people that actually did believe it was real. And then swing music, and this happens, and you can play the clips. These are some clips from a movie called Swing Kids, which we may actually put a project on when we get to World War II for. Um, Swing music was jazz. What happens is when African Americans or other cultural groups create a musical or cultural style that it then is mainstreamed, that white musicians or industry musicians will then take that sound and develop their own mainstream sound. So, like, for example, rock and roll. Many of the early performers of rock and roll, we'll talk about this again later, were African American, and it had very much a blues jazz sound to it in the 1950s, early 50s. But the problem was because of racism and because in many states they couldn't play that music, they had to find white performers that could sing and play that music, but were socially acceptable. Well, and that's what happened with Elvis Presley or Buddy Holly or uh, you know other Jerry Lee Lewis. They were able to take that African American sound and turn it into a mainstream musical style. Same here. These are big bands. They're like large band ensembles. They take jazz and blues sounds and turn them into a acceptable cultural component to white society. On top of it, this music was danceable. And because of what came out of the jazz and blues clubs, that now music is a dance. Music was something you listen to. Now music is something you interact with, which starts the beginning of what we call a teen culture. That you get this idea that teenagers learn these dances and then or young adults learn these dances and go out and socialize by doing them, which then creates a new type of dating and opens up promiscuity and everything else because you're leaving the home and you're going dancing and you're interacting with people of the opposite sex. It changes the way people think of dating and how they interact with each other. That teen culture and dating concept created by swing music and swing dancing then continues into the 50s with the baby boomers now and rock and roll. You just need the teenagers. You're trendsetters. Did you know that? So this is Benny Goodman right here, right? This is somewhere in here would be Glenn Miller, but these are examples right here. You can watch in. This is of dancing and music at that time. Sports, like I said, this here gives you kind of breakdown of all the major sporting events. 19. This is when sports became very popular. You had the Yankees, who had the longest running World Series wins, and you had these superstars like Lou Gehrig, Babe Ruth. That are setting the tone for baseball, and they become household names. Sports, and that was the thing also about artists in the movies that for the first time movie actors weren't before this weren't seen as that big of a cultural thing. They're paid about the same as someone who did your dishes, right? And now all of a sudden they're these fashionistas. They're these people with power and people look up to them. That's what happened with baseball. Baseball went from this thing you played on a weekend for fun now became where you're making thousands of dollars. Like Babe Ruth makes more than the president at one time. And you're creating this idea that sports and and fame go together. But also, this was a different time. You want to talk about cultural difference? Babe Ruth would literally hang out at the ballpark and he'd sign every single kid's baseball or baseball card. Lou Gehrig, you could put your baseball card in an envelope with his face and a return you put an envelope with it in it inside an envelope, and you put your return address on one envelope and you mailed it to him. He would sign your card and mail it back to you. You can't get that today. They charge you $300 just to stand in line to see them and sign and to get something that's already pre-signed. It's a whole different attitude. But this is the beginning of that star power. The biggest thing was this: is Jesse Owens. Jesse Owens going to win 4 gold medals at the Olympics. Him and his teammates are African American. Several of them, not all of them. They win 4 gold medals. He does in the Olympics in '36, which is supposed to be a demonstration of Hitler's master race and his pure racial purity. And here, a child of a sharecropper who, when he gets back to the United States, can't eat in a restaurant because of his race. He hands a defeat to the Nazis. And he sets the stage then. Think about this culturally. It's not far to go from Jesse Owens in 1936, or, and this is a clip here, you can watch this, or Joe Louis is a boxer who's African American, to where you get to Hank Aaron and the integration of baseball, and then later to people like Michael Jordan and African American players today. They open the door. And then when sports comes in, and you see this in World War II, where you see where African Americans, this is also going to help create the civil rights movement. There's this idea of pride, cultural pride, that I can be equal to them. And it's going to help feed, along with World War II and changing economics and the advent of television, give a route to the civil rights movement. And he defeats Max Schmeling, who was, again, a German, and Hitler saw as a pride to the German state. So, and he beats him. All right. After Schmeling beat him the first time, and Lewis comes back and beats him down. And then Seabiscuit, Triple Crown winner. Okay. Salvador Dali and art, this beginning of the Surrealist movement. Now, superheroes, this is the beginning of the comic book era, which are very popular today. You wouldn't have superheroes, which today, if you think about the Marvel movies, and that reflect our social norms. And we'll talk more about how this reflects in the 50s. How comic books got started is they would publish cartoons in the newspaper, and then they would collect these things that had already been in the newspaper and then print them in books form. And kids would buy these for like 10 cents in that. Well, they were looking for a comic book that was a comic book, that it came out was fresh and new. This was created by a Jewish writer and a Jewish artist. Okay. Um, and that Superman literally is the very first superhero. Okay. He's the very first one that comes out of the door. And if you think about it, Superman reflects the 1930s. He's an immigrant who comes to America. He blends in. Remember, he's Clark Kent. He blends into society, but he uses his natural abilities to make America great. He fights for truth, justice, and the American way. He's the immigrant story. Batman, who soon comes after, he's a little bit of a different story. Batman reflects the crime, like you saw in what we talked about, the cause of the Great Depression. You're going to have a lot of crime, bank robbers, organized crime, things like that in the 1930s. And when his parents are killed, Batman goes off to seek justice. And he comes out in Detective Comics 27. And this Batman is more like the Batman today. He reflects the violence of the times. He would beat these people up, and he carried guns. He shot the bad guys. And so Batman and Superman reflect in Batman's case, he reflects the violence of the time. And in Superman, he reflects what we think is good about ourselves, the immigrant story of someone who comes and makes good in America. So comics then, as we go through, will reflect those ideas. We'll talk about again in the 40s. That's you see the introduction of Robin and things like that. For Marvel Comics, also showed up in the late 30s. The very first one, Marvel Comics, is going to be this idea of the Human Torch and Submariner. And it's very much this battle between two forces. And you see this coming in what's happening in Europe. The ideas of imperial power and of Japan and Germany versus the democratic ideas of America. And so there's this battling ideas. In the end, they come to an agreement and they go their separate ways. So, but it's the beginning of Marvel Comics. Marvel Comics is going to reflect more the society in the 50s. Like what you think of more of Marvel Comics is a 50s, 60s thing. And we'll talk more about that when we get there. As far as books, Brave New World, Huxley, that this dystopian future, that basically the world, it's that part of that lost generation of writers. The Hobbit, again, lost generation. It starts with Tolkien's The Hobbit, and then later writes Lord of the Rings, which is feeds off of The Hobbit. Steinbeck, we've already talked about him. We will talk about him in another PowerPoint with Grapes of Wrath. Again, part of that lost generation of where I did everything I was supposed to, and society turned its back on me. And he writes a lot about the mental issues and the physical issues of the Great Depression. Good Earth, about poverty in China, A Yearling, and of course the science fiction also was a thing. And again, the fear of the other, right? Who Goes There is the book, is a short story, but it later turns into what we call The Thing in 1982. Now there's a 1940s, 50s version of this movie of The Creature, right? Is what it's called. And then in 1982, the real story, the short story gets turned into John Carpenter's The Thing, and then later in 2011, there's a new one. I prefer, by the way, I think the best one is the John Carpenter one in 1982 of The Thing. Its special effects are just gross but over the top, and it's got a great story, and the way it ends, you have to see it. Okay, and then Nausea by John Paul Sartre. It's part of that whole nihilism and existentialism concepts we talked about. So again, culture reflects either what we see as important, like you saw that in the comic books, or we saw that in the movies, or it reflects our own fears and ideas, like we saw with Dracula or The Thing. And it also, the changing cultural thing addresses social issues. That's Jesse Owens, where he's putting in your face, I can defeat the Nazis, but you won't let me buy a hot dog. So culture is going to be important, and it's the way we react to things or how we are shaped by the things around us. So we'll talk more about this with each chapter. All right.